Reading from the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 1 to 11. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors, when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. A young boy sat beside his grandfather on a starry night. They were camping in the desert, and the darkness stretched endlessly around them. The boy had just learned about the solar system in school. Curious, he asked his grandfather, Grandpa, how far does space go? His grandfather replied, Farther than your eyes can see or your mind can stretch. The boy frowned. But why don't God tell us everything? Why doesn't He just explain it all? The old man paused, looked at the stars, and said gently, Sometimes God answers us not with explanations, but with wonder. His questions are often the answers that we need. This truth echoes powerfully in the book of Job. After a long and painful silence, when God finally speaks, it is not to explain, not to justify, not to argue, but to question. But in those questions, something incredible happens. Job finds that God has answered him, not by helping him to understand everything, but by seeing God rightly. After all the speeches, the painful debates between Job and his friends, Job's self-defense, and a passionate monologue from the young Elihu, there is a pause. There is nothing more for man to say. It is then, in Job 38, verse 1, that the narrative shifts dramatically. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. God had waited patiently while Job hurled his questions at the heavens, honest, raw, agonizing ones. Why was I born? Why do the wicked prosper? Why do you treat me as an enemy? Job demanded a chance to present his case before God without fear. He wanted answers, even saying in Job 31:37, I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. God's first words make the divine presence very clear. Who is this who obscures my counsel by words without knowledge? And the following words, at first sight, seem like an answer to Job's desperate demands. It appears that the Lord is inviting him to speak for himself. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Verse 3. But what follows is not a direct response to Job's complaints. Instead, God asks Job a barrage of questions. Questions about creation, about the sea, the dawn, the rain, the stars, the wild animals. God begins, Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Verse 4. The question is not meant to belittle Job, but to lift and expand his vision from his despair, from his own seemingly ruined life, to the vastness of the God he serves, who has brought an immense universe into being by his might and understanding. He is not dismissing Job's pain, but placing it within the larger frame of divine wisdom and power. The Lord's questions challenge our abilities, our command of the elementary forces of nature, of the air, of the deep, of the heavenly lights. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? And have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Verse 16. With each successive question, God draws Job's attention to his meticulous involvement in the world, from the movement of the stars to the feeding of lions and ravens. Chapter 39 is filled with descriptions of the animal world and its mysteries. Why does the ostrich behave so fearlessly yet forget to guard its eggs? Who taught the hawk to soar? How marvelous is the horse's readiness to gallop into battle when it hears the bugle note. These questions take Job's attention off his immediate and highly personal circumstances. He begins to see that he is surrounded by wonder, by mysteries that testify that the world is not directed by random chance, but by careful, deliberate design. Yet, these mysteries of the natural world are far beyond his comprehension, wise man though he is. How then could he possibly understand the complexities of divine justice and providence, directing people made in the image of God? How could he hope to embrace the mystery of human free will, interacting with God's sovereignty, exercised in wisdom, love, and righteousness? If he cannot grasp why the mountain goat gives birth at a certain time, how can he judge the timing of God's plans? In chapter 40, there's a pause as God waits for Job to respond. But Job has nothing to say. Humbled and quiet, he says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth." Chapter 40, verse 4. Gently but firmly, he presses further. If you want to question me, then adorn yourself with majesty and dignity and judge the proud like I do. Show me you can govern the world with righteousness. To drive home the point, God describes the impregnable might of two of his foremost creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. Whether living or extinct, these creatures were untamable and unmatched in strength, except by God. And could the man who falls before this really hope to hold his own against God, their creator, who plays with them and brings them to his feet as his toys? Yet, these overwhelming images are not meant to terrify Job into silence, but to comfort him into trust. In describing them, God reveals not only his power, but his control. In Psalm 104, we are told that Leviathan was made to play in the sea. In Psalm 74, verse 14, we read that God crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the wilderness creatures. In other words, even this great monster is under God's leash. In Job's hitherto shaken and disordered world of pain, God has masterfully reminded him of his own sovereignty and sheer power. Nothing has slipped beyond God's control. Even in the wilderness, there is obedience. Even in the unknown, there is care. Even in pain, there is divine presence. God never actually answers Job's questions. He doesn't explain the reason for Job's suffering. He doesn't vindicate Job or rebuke his friends right yet. All he does is show Job that he's there with him. That is all finally what that Job needs. The presence of God, the favor of God. God's questions were his answers. They were not meant to inform Job, but to transform him, to shift him from protest to awe, from despair to trust. We too have so many questions. Why the sickness to that person? Why is it so hard to find work, to access opportunities? Why does evil thrive and the good struggle for its life? Why does God seem silent at times? aloud or silently. We cry, we wrestle, and finally we wait. And then God answers with His presence, not with reasons, but with reminders of His power, His care, His knowledge of every sparrow, every drop of rain, every hair on our heads. We read in Matthew 10, verse 29, where Jesus said, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care." When life overwhelms us, when our prayers seem to echo in silence, let us remember, silence is not absence, delay is not neglect, and divine questions are not diversions. They are God's invitations to trust, to rest in a wisdom immeasurably greater than our own. We may never know why certain things happen, but we do know who directs the world and our lives. In the whirlwind of suffering, confusion, or loss, let us listen for the Lord to speak. For in the storm, He will reveal Himself so that we may say, like Job, "Now I see you." And that will be more than enough. God bless.